Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Your Legislators. I'm Anthony Morneau. Joining us for this episode is District 33 Democratic State Representative Micaela Lara Cadena, who serves as Vice Chair for the House Judiciary Committee and also serves on the House Taxation and Revenue Committee. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Thank you, Anthony. I'm glad to be in the conversation.
Of course, this is a budget-focused legislative session, which is coming to an end as we are talking this week. So I'd like to hear from you. With the budget, you're getting a better idea of how it's going to be finalized. What are some things in it that you are the most excited about?
I appreciate that question. Yes, for your listening audience, in the New Mexico Legislature, we rotate between a 60-day policy session, as it's considered, and the 30-day budget session, in which our primary responsibility is to get House Bill 2 out. This year, it's an over $8 billion budget. Some of the things that have been really important to me as I've watched the appropriation process play out is the ways that we are committing and centering New Mexico educators in this process. So teachers and folks that really do so much in raising our children every day, who are in these classrooms with our little ones, certainly, I believe, have been undervalued and under-resourced for far too long. So I'm proud that among other high priority items between the governor's office, House and Senate leadership, in a bipartisan way, we've made sure to both invest in teachers as well as raise minimum wages for public workers as well.
Okay, now with this move, do you think it could really help address that teacher shortage that New Mexico is facing? Many may be aware of the National Guard being called in to serve as substitute teachers throughout the state. Your thoughts on how this budget could really address that issue with the teacher shortage?
Yes, thank you, Anthony. I am a legislator that's also a working mom. I have 2 kids in Las Cruces Public Schools. So yes, we are one of the school districts that has invited and called on National Guards members to show up in our classrooms. And certainly, I think that's a signal and a symbol of how drastic and important it is to have these conversations about bringing more committed folks, smart folks ready to be in the classroom into these professional opportunities, but also that we are going to have to be creative to navigate that situation in the meantime. Both of my parents were classroom teachers. So my mom was an elementary ed teacher in Las Cruces Public Schools for 30 years. My father was still teaching when he passed away a year ago at El Magordo High. So my sisters and I were raised by parents who put everything they had into graduating from NMSU and then giving back by being part of the growing up of so many kids around New Mexico. So I certainly, when I see these initiatives moving, know that that's going to be a big part. Like we will now have so much more opportunity to hopefully pull in New Mexico's brightest back into these kind of jobs where they will actually be paid their worth. And Anthony, one thing I've often said is that you can see a government's priorities when you look at their budget. And I'm so proud that after so many years of under-resourcing our teachers, you can see that we are actually finally having honest conversations about making sure these folks are paid their worth for the incredible lift and responsibility they have every day.
Now, I'm sure a lot of folks are excited about the raises for the teachers and educators in New Mexico, but what about the next generation of teachers that may be entering college at the time with those educational programs throughout the state? What in this budget is going to help not only retain qualified faculty, but also ensure that the next generation of teachers are ready to step in and fill roles? As we know, many teachers are retiring, baby boomers are retiring, so it's an urgent time to fill these roles. So do the schools in the state, the colleges, higher education institutions have the resources in this budget?
Anthony, it means a lot to me that most of New Mexico State University, the academic campus, sits within House District 33. So I represent NMSU along with our Majority Whip Representative Doreen Gallegos, who has the East Side, Pan Am Stadium, some parts of campus. And I stay in close contact with our NMSU leadership. I'm really proud of the team they send to Santa Fe, because it's important that we raise and center the considerations about how NMSU is positioned within New Mexico's higher ed landscape. Because of that, and at home, some of the team we send to Santa Fe are known as the state's renowned experts on those higher ed budgets, including my dear friend Ricardo Rell. And what they've done this year through the Council of University Presidents is really make sure that the funding formulas and the ways that dollars get drawn back home consider these equity questions, consider how we're actually in K through 12 schools recruiting and inspiring young people to potentially want to be in the classroom. But certainly NMSU is a place that has continued to graduate some of New Mexico's best teachers. And we've followed through on some of the commitments we've been asked related to those budgets. We also, in this coming fiscal year, we'll be looking at how capital outlay dollars can also expand the reach of and impact of NMSU. But they are definitely solid in the ways they've put out so many of the professions we need, from our educators, but also to our nursing school as well.
Okay, I want to move on and talk about another big issue this legislative session, and that has been public safety. The governor has called for legislation to address violent crimes that are happening in this state. I'd like to hear your thoughts about what you see happening with this legislative session and efforts to hold violent offenders accountable and ensure that they are in detention and remain there if they are violent. There's calls for legislation for that to happen. Your thoughts on that issue? Because I know you have a background in recidivism. So it'd be great to hear your thoughts on the calls for stronger public safety in the state, because we're coming out of a time where there's been a lot of news about violent crimes happening across New Mexico. Recently in the news, 11 people were stabbed in Albuquerque in what's being called a random stabbing attack. This has gained a lot of attention across the nation. Your thoughts on what the legislature can do to address public safety?
Thank you, Anthony. And yes, in my couple of terms up here in Santa Fe, criminal legal reform has been part of the commitments I've made and the legislation that I've prioritized. Just to be honest, I think your viewers deserve that. I did not support the tough on crime bills introduced with the governor's backing and push, and carried by some folks in my House Democratic caucus. I've been clear about that. I've been respectful about that. And yes, it goes back to the decades that I've been looking at the criminal legal systems in New Mexico and really considering what it might take to actually improve public safety. For a couple of years, I did serve as the recidivism reduction at the New Mexico Corrections Department and got to have that inside view and looking at like what's happening related to criminal activity and what's happening when most folks that we incarcerate, over 95% of them, of course, eventually return to our neighborhoods and communities. I think one of the most compelling things we can do as elected officials is to admit when we don't have the answers, is to admit that there's no fix, no bill, no drop of money we could do that would make our community safer overnight. I'm not sure where we should go, but I know the kind of investments that are needed to impact cycles of poverty, to have programs and resources available for folks that have underlying addiction and trauma in their backgrounds to get the care they need before and while they are showing up in the criminal legal system. Those are the kind of investments that I believe would make a real difference in the long run. But it's also, it's a hard pill to swallow because one, we haven't got started on that path, but we might see outcomes and returns on those investments in decades. But I when I looked at the legislation as it was introduced, it seemed like it was a symbolic way to offer solutions that I frankly did not think would actually improve public safety.
Do you think this was just like an election year push to get some legislation
Yes.
that I'm doing something to address public safety?
I do. I think that.
Okay.
From several of the players involved.
Okay. So your thoughts with your background as working in the corrections department for 10 years, you have to have an understanding of what isn't working. Maybe you could share that with us.
I was only in the corrections department, Anthony, for a couple of years, but yes,
Okay.
I've been doing criminal justice reform for a decade plus.
Okay, thanks for that correction. Yeah, it'd be great to hear you. If
Yeah.
you're just in there for a couple of years, you have to have an understanding of what isn't working.
Yeah. Um, what is not working is that we lock up folks that are struggling with substance use disorders, behavioral health issues, without any actually investments in evidence-based programming or promising practices that might shift or give people room to change their lives. So when we lock someone up in jails or prisons, depending on what part of the system they are, there are collateral consequences to that. Sometimes people are losing jobs. Sometimes people are disrupting like family relationships they have. And frankly, they're coming out with a criminal record. I certainly believe that when people are engaged in criminal activity, that there should be a system that catches that and attempts to course correct that. But in New Mexico, we're a state with some of the highest levels of poverty in the country. We are failing to protect kids and keep kids safe as little ones. Eventually, a lot of our people, our families, people I love and care for, are struggling with addiction and substance use disorders. And eventually, they fall into criminal charges. And we, along that whole path, have not provided consistent, reliable, accessible resources so that they might have a different opportunity or a different path towards a safety and stability someday. So when we treat addiction as a crime and not a healthcare issue, we are not only throwing away people as if they don't have any worth or value or opportunity to be part of our families in a healthy way, our communities in a healthy way. We are also spending a lot of money locking people up who are eventually going to come out more hardened, more street savvy, and with less opportunity to have jobs and housing and other opportunities. So that to me is the most significant thing that we've done wrong in New Mexico, is leveled punitive measures at folks struggling with addiction and not put the money and resources into our state so that folks had a path, had a possibility of actually getting care and resource for their addictions.
So what are some steps that you think lawmakers could do to address this situation? Because we are at a time where there is this excess in revenue to the state. Why can't the state address this issue? I mean, maybe you can inform us that they're looking at it. I mean, where are some ways where we can expand treatment for this?
In this year's budget, we have millions of dollars in violence intervention programs so that folks that have already been impacted as victims have different pathways besides retaliation when someone they love is shot or killed. We have bills moving and money in the budget to begin looking at what kind of drug and alcohol treatment programs are available to folks, especially in rural New Mexico. I've loved all sorts of people in my life that have struggled with addiction, including moms. And one of the things that's remained real for decades is that if a mom is stuck between a rock and a hard place, if she is ready to try something different, like sick and tired of being sick and tired, but doesn't have anywhere safe to leave her kids, there's no way she can do a 45-day program if otherwise her kids are not cared for. So one of the things that I've always said, and there's new pockets of that happening up north in Rio Arriba County, I'd love to see more, is we need treatment programs where moms can bring their kids with them so that they can have family counseling and holistic care. Because one of the things that's heartbreaking here is that when parents are struggling with addiction, there are impacts on their kids. Those kids can be very loved, but yeah, if your parent's sick, your parent's sick. There will be impacts to that and trauma in your life. So there's more money in this year's budget than ever to these kind of both harm reduction approaches, but also more thoughtful programming and farther out into the rural parts of our state.
Okay, we look forward to learning more about that. I want to talk with you about another issue, and that is just addressing the child tax credit. I know you've been involved with this issue. Your thoughts on what New Mexico is going to do to help a resident with less than $25,000 in total income to be eligible for that tax credit at $350 a child. Now, there may be updates with this that you may know from your committee, but it'd be great to learn more about this because I know that this was something that you spoke pretty passionate about.
Yes, thank you. In 2019, myself and now Representative Chandler, who's become Representative Chandler, who's now become the chair of our House Tax Committee. We co-sponsored a bill so that New Mexicans could receive a refundable child tax credit up to a certain dollar amount per qualifying child. We had done so in 2019 because the federal government had made changes that didn't make that credit realistic anymore, which meant that in New Mexico, because of the ways we piggyback on the federal system, that we were going to bring in an approximate $55 million which usually had come through as child tax credits. So we'd offered solutions a couple of years ago. They weren't picked up at the time, but certainly as we work to get out of COVID and just the economic crisis and desperation that so many of our families have felt over the last couple of years, I'm really proud that our child tax credit is, as of this morning, part of House Bill 163, the tax package for the year that has just come out of our committee and is moving to the House floor. We brought those dollars down a bit, in part because we have to, when we reduce taxes, we bring in less revenue or offer a credit. That means we are having an impact on New Mexico's budget, which of course is the funding mechanism for the programs and services that our government is obligated to provide. So we brought the dollar amount, but yes, it's a tax that offers that credit based on how much the filer, whether it's a head of household or a married couple, have in their income.
Okay. Speaking of taxes, you mentioned that big tax package. There's been a major call for the tax on Social Security in New Mexico to be repealed. I'd like to hear where you stand on the issue and why.
Thank you, Anthony. I did not support a flat-out repeal, again, because that would have been a regressive tax. That meant that folks in New Mexico that are still very high income earners, including in their retirement, would not be putting some of those monies back into our general fund revenue. And a flat-out repeal would have cost New Mexico upwards of $100 million. What I always argued in a bipartisan way with some of my favorite Republican colleagues on tax, as well as some of my Democratic friends, is that because this was so regressive in nature, it was important for us to say low-income seniors in New Mexico were never paying tax on Social Security because, frankly, as a tax policy, we knew they couldn't afford it. What we've done now, the compromise that came out in House Bill 163, is supposed to hopefully give more relief to some of those middle-income New Mexicans. So I think for a single filer or we now have a cap, I think it's at $100,000. So for folks that are making more than $100,000 in New Mexico in their retirement, they will still be obligated to pay tax on that Social Security income. For families or filers making less than $100,000, they will no longer have that tax liability. Again, this is the proposal as it's left the House, or as it's left the committee I serve on, House Tax. There could be amendments that move through, but I do think it was a reasonable compromise, so that the folks that had room to afford to continue to invest in our state and help lift the resources that our families depend on will still be in that position to do so, and middle-income families will now not have that tax obligation.
Compromise, a word you don't really hear too often when you're talking about politics and government. So I'd like to move on and talk with you about another major issue over the past year, and that has been adult use cannabis. We had you on a special last year about that, and you shared your thoughts. You played a role in helping design when it comes to taxing that issue. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on how you feel adult use cannabis is going right now at this moment, because we have until April when the retail sales are supposed to be up and running. How do you feel about this new industry in New Mexico, and are you confident that it's going to be up and running and ready to go by April?
I have a high level of confidence in Superintendent Linda Trujillo, who oversees the Regulation and Licensing Division and was tasked with bringing up a cannabis division to oversee and carry through this whole process. I have concerns that her office does need sufficient resources to hold these big jobs that we expect them to do. So I'm proud that they've continued to have additional consideration as they move through the budgeting process. Again, because we can't expect our state agencies to lift the responsibilities that we haven't resourced them for. So hopefully that their budget continues to be held carefully. I also would just add that when we move massive pieces of legislation like this, we sometimes, there are sometimes gaps in our intention, in our effectiveness. Like sometimes we think we've pulled something off, but we didn't word it the right way. There is a cleanup bill moving, I think it's still in the Senate, that is going to catch some of those pieces that we just didn't get right in the original legislation. So I look forward to seeing that bill when it gets to House Judiciary. But otherwise, what I've heard is that in these first rounds of licenses, looking at the multiple kinds of licenses that people might invest in and then operate in the new cannabis industry, that there's been over 700 licenses submitted so far. As we get out of the session, I'm going to look for more data. I'd like to hear what's happening down south. I'd like to hear and make sure that folks in Doñana are given a fair look and consideration as they move through that process and invest in their own economic development opportunities at home.
So are you concerned right now that this industry is really going to favor businesses up north than further south?
My concern, Anthony, was always that folks that have the capital, a lot of capital to get into this, are going to continue to be the big earners. When in my mind, we're still coming out of what was a multi-decades, 30 plus years racist drug war that locked up brown and Black people in particular for the ways that they were involved in street economies and marijuana specifically. And now that there's a lot of out-of-state money coming in to make some big profits. So I will continue to ask questions. I'm glad that we had equity considerations in the cannabis bill, but I'd like to see how those come through, because yeah, there's some families that have potentially used marijuana for medicinal purposes or other ways for a long time. And I hope whether they're farmers with a little piece of land or entrepreneurs that are ready to set up shop somewhere close to home, that they have a fair shot at getting in.
Okay. Now, you're a Democrat. I'd like to hear from you, since we had some news break this morning that could affect your party in some way, and also some people in Albuquerque. State Representative Georgine Lewis, it was reported by the Albuquerque Journal, was arrested on drunken driving charges. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, because she chairs the House Government Elections and Indian Affairs Committee. As somebody who also serves with her on the House Judiciary, I'd like to hear your thoughts on, do you think that she should resign from her chairmanship on that committee, and resign in general? I know there's a lot that still needs to be learned on this issue, but your thoughts as somebody who serves in the party.
Thank you. Chair Lewis is one of the most skilled and committed legislators that I've known in the years that I've done issue-based advocacy, my years in state government, and now as a colleague in the body. I don't have any other comments at this time, but again, I know that in New Mexico, so many of our families are impacted by trauma, are struggling with substance use every single day, and I continue to hope and pray that all the women and families and folks I care about and love have access to the care that they deserve. And you know, she's an incredible legislator. I imagine we'll have more information in the coming days.
Okay, I wanted to bring that up as it just broke this morning. I want to move on and talk about another issue, though, that I think when we pull the lens back on New Mexico's legislative body and the process that it undergoes, you try to do a lot of work in 30 days and 60 days. Is it time that the New Mexico legislature rethinks the way it is doing legislative work? And do you think it's time for state lawmakers in New Mexico to be paid a salary?
Certainly. This is often the question of the hour, Anthony. New Mexico, as your viewers may not be familiar with, is the only remaining state where we as legislators don't receive a single dollar for our service. That's an idea that used to resonate with me. I took it as a point of pride that here we are, almost this like renegade body that's showing up because our commitments are clear, because our communities deserve real representation. But there are certainly some flaws with that system. Namely that most of us, there are definitely folks that are independently wealthy or retired, but it's hard to get New Mexicans with different lived experiences and expertise into this body, because who can take off, a month every other year, 2 months on odd number years to leave everything behind and come to the Capitol and try to catch up quickly, become informed, become aware, and take these monumental votes on things that absolutely shape and shift New Mexicans' lives every day. So certainly, people often joke around here, like, you get what you pay for. And when we have an unpaid legislature, it means that we are doing the best we can to catch up quickly and take votes that have huge consequence. We also don't have any year-round staff, so that means we rely on information, often in a hurry, as quickly as we can to try to, again, make informed and educated decisions about these votes. I have been supportive of potentially a constitutional amendment so that we could lift the ban on paying legislators and then have an outside body actually consider what a fair rate would be, what a salary might look like, and then in turn what the expectations would come if we were able to resource the body in that way. In terms of the question of the time crunch, it's real. Like, to say that we're going to run in, look quickly at $8 billion and how it should be spent, and then pass that budget in 30 days, it puts a lot of pressure. And shout out to the Appropriations Committee that does. They do their best to study these numbers and these priorities all year round. But then we get here in a hurry, we have big committee hearings, and we roll things out. I've heard proposals that I've supported that potentially might consider that New Mexico should just be a 45-day session every year, so that every year we had the room and the time to be deliberate and thoughtful as a body in doing the people's work.
Okay, unfortunately we're out of time, but I want to thank you so much, State Representative Micaela Lara Cadena. Thank you for joining us on Your Legislators.
Thank you.
And we want to thank you for joining us for the program. I'm Anthony Murnau. We'll see you next time.